This episode is supported by World of Learning Conference and Exhibition. Don't miss the leading L&D event returning to the NEC Birmingham on the 6th and 7th of October. Learn, discover, interact, network. Entry to the exhibition is free or upgrade for full conference access. Register now at learnevent.com.
Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to Great Minds on Learning. In this acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of learning theory, from the Greeks to the geeks. This season we're looking at learning that happens outside training rooms, lecture halls and learning management systems. Last time sport, this time the people who make things, designers, film crews, painters, musicians. The arts have taught skill for centuries by apprenticeship, imitation and public criticism. Donald and John think that's a body of knowledge worth borrowing from. Join them as they ask how creative people learn their craft and what AI is doing to it. If a machine can do the difficult part, what is a skill now worth?
Hi everybody. I'm here as ever with my valued and knowledgeable co-host, Donald Clark.
Hello.
Donald, our topic this time was oddly difficult to sum up in a phrase, wasn't it? We're looking at the creative arts and in particular music and visual art, but how to express that in a heading. For a start, words like art and the arts have an honorific meaning that tends to be heavily class-coded, a bit of a turn-off for some. And we want to cover applied arts and design as well as the stuff that happens in galleries and opera houses. So we're going to move fluidly across the boundary that separates high culture from popular culture in asking how it is that creative people learn to do the stuff that they do. We recognise that's a contentious thing to do. There's even a problem with the word art itself. But again, Donald, you didn't like the term so beloved of politicians when addressing this area, creative industries. And I wonder why that is. What have you got against that?
Creative industries, yeah. Well, it goes back to many years ago when I was actually on the board of a thing called Skillset, which was the Creative Industries Skills Board for the UK. And, England, not UK. And it was a very odd experience because even then, the whole thing, the word creative art and so on, just suffered from this massive problem of definition, which was reinforced. I became the deputy chair for 10 years of the Brighton and Hove Dome and Festival, the biggest art organisation outside of London and England. But it was really a problem. It always struck me as a really odd term, mainly because when you're in a room with everybody representing, music, film, television, and so on, and this notion of what is creativity and so on, everybody thinks their art form is important, they're the main feature, everybody else is in the credits sort of thing, But I always think, it was like the computer games people, the film people thought they were the bee's knees. They thought television was slightly over there, not quite art. And they thought the games people thought they were the future and this was the past. And the publishing people, they were like not even there for some people in terms of an art form because it was seen as already dead. But there's a lot of hubris in the area, I think, for one reason or another. You sort of hinted at the snobbery there, but I think that, there's no shortage of imagination, especially when you're imagining your own importance in this field. So it's plagued with all sorts of strange snobberies and hierarchies and so on, especially when people are chasing for funding. So that's why I became a bit suspicious about almost that governmental term, creative industries, which is what it is.
So in a way, a bit like sport in that strong emotions and rivalries are aroused, although, it's different because it's kind of class-based and so on.
Yeah.
So anyway, we decided in the end to focus on the people who do the stuff, creators. I'm keenly aware that's a fashionable term at the moment, creators, especially in the digital realm. And that term itself will now no doubt be thought problematical or in for a dig and just old hat in a decade or so's time. The language changes around all these things.
Yeah.
And at this point, we should make our disclosures. For my part, as I mentioned during our episode on sport, I've been fairly artistic at school. And Donald, you've given a little kind of hint of your involvement with art there. I ought to mention my own, which is kind of on the creator side, to be grand about it. I've been a working musician and songwriter. I've written a published novel and a TV series and appeared in a TV series. I've worked in advertising and arts PR. My wife, whose relatives are all writers, actors and directors, are a Dublin family, worked for the Brighton Artists Open Houses, which takes place in the part right where you live now, Donald, where I used to live. One of my daughters is an illustrator. Another studied jazz at a music conservatoire, Trinity College. I suppose I'm arty as fuck. It kind of goes through me like Brighton rock, as it were. So that's my disclosures out the way. But Donald, people will know you as a tech entrepreneur, an academic, but you're also a writer and a thought leader, if we can use that, again, disputed term. And tell us about your activities in the arts beyond what you've already mentioned.
Yeah, it's a bit different in the sense that, I grew up in Scotland in towns that had no cinema, no theatre. I had never been to the theatre until I went to university or an art gallery, not once. But then I went to the University of Edinburgh, which of course had the festival, and had my eyes sort of opened a little bit there. But, I have no family background or anything in the arts at all, apart from two rather unusual examples. One is my grandfather, who's a professional soldier, fought through the First and Second World War. He, between the wars, came out for 2 years and became a stand-up comedian, believe it or not, playing musicals and so on.
I can't believe it. It's in the genes.
It was I remember my mother telling me this, just off the cuff, and I thought, wow, that's amazing, tell me more. And he was in a little group called the Jolly Rogers. He was the gag guy, stand up, tell gags. And then these two other guys would come on stage. One was huge, literally 6'5", huge, 20 stone. And then he had a suitcase, and inside the suitcase, he would bring out his ventriloquist dummy, which wasn't a ventriloquist dummy. It was actually a small person with makeup to look like a ventriloquist dummy. And he would do that thing, which is incredibly, I think, creative and innovative sort of act. I think it would go down well today. But anyway, that was it. And the second one was really unusual. My wife's cousin married Barry Gibb of the Bee Gees, the lead singer. So we used to go there over to America a lot. So I got to know a musician, and speaking to him was very interesting, that whole fame thing and so on. But other than that, really, I was brought up in Calvinist Scotland. However, just like you, moved to Brighton, and the first people I met, almost by accident, were all ex-art school bods like yourself, John, which is really fantastic for me. Man, I often say it helped me slough my Calvinist skin, and then eventually I sort of retired a bit early. I had a lot of time, so I really sort of took a deep dive. Used to go to London a lot of exhibitions, visual arts exhibitions, theatre, and so on. And then eventually I became I was still working the deputy chair of the Brighton Folk Festival. It's Folk Festival in the Dome, so that's the big. We have one big, huge concert hall, a sizable, a middle-sized theatre and a small theatre, and we ran that all year round and have, as anybody in Brighton knows, a full festival in May, which ran for the whole month. So we take the profits from that and put it all commissioning work in dance, theatre and all sorts of things. So I did that for 10 years. So I really took a deep dive into the arts through that and was on Skillset, as I mentioned. So, moving to Brighton did me a lot of good, I think, John. It was a world you sort of knew and got into quickly. It took me some time, but I got there in the end.
Yeah. Well, I should say I used to do arts PR for the Brighton Festival at one point, and my wife's uncle was a director of the Brighton Festival back in the day. So now I think we've owned up fairly thoroughly to our connections with the creative community. Donald, give us an overview of what we're going to cover.
Okay. Well, just like the last one, actually, a game of two halves, really. But I'd like to cover some key figures. I mean, there are many, many people who talk about learning and the arts, but I think I've gone for four figures that I think are very representative. And it shows real progression as well, which I like. One is to go back to the Victorians, where people really started to reflect, because you then had mass schooling. So people were reflecting on the role in the arts and education for the first time. And then you have this towering figure, John Ruskin, who's a sort of a bit of a moralizing romantic, to be honest, but we'll touch on him. And then Herbert Reed. I like Herbert Reed because he was the first to bring in cognition, albeit rather odd psychoanalytic stuff, but a really interesting figure who reflected quite deeply on the relation of the mind in terms of learning and the arts. And then a figure I really, really like, and that's Elliot Eisner, because he took cognition, namely, the way in which the brain operates through heart, hand, and head, essentially those different components, and really took a deep dive into that notion of the arts and education. And lastly, Ken Robinson, whom every teacher in the UK certainly would know. And this is an odd one, because I'm going to be a bit controversial in that one, because I think that took a bit of a step backwards with rather hokey theories about very young children being massively creative and all we do is knock the stuffing out of them as they go forward. I just think that's a complete caricature. So hopefully we'll get a nice spectrum of people. And then, of course, we're going to take a deep dive into a few things like the applied arts, screen and audio visual, film and TV, that sort of stuff, and even the performing arts. So hopefully we'll start to make it more practical then. Does that make sense?
Certainly does.
Great.
So first of all, 4 thinkers. Let's start with a bit of theory. 4 thinkers who put art at the centre of education to anchor ourselves. 4 big figures who thought deeply and wrote very influentially about arts and creativity in relation to education. So let's start with John Ruskin, 1819 to 1900, the most influential art critic of Victorian Britain, champion of Turner and the Pre-Raphaelites, a social critic whose ideas fed William Morris, the welfare state. Marcel Proust, oddly, was a big fan of Ruskin's, and Gandhi. He taught drawing to working men, and he turned those lessons into The Elements of Drawing, published 1857. Donald, tell us about Ruskin and education.
That was a nice little introduction there, because that teaching working men drawing and sewing, and he was really interested in the social dimension of art, and he actually literally saw art as something that was not only entwined but inseparable from Victorian morality, which was a big feature of his writing, certainly, and certainly labour and society. He was deeply embedded in that notion that art was part of life itself, and especially work, which is interesting. So, it's how. And then he has a sort of background learning theory here about the arts, which is it's important to understand that art gives us the ability to see things, especially through drawing, but also aesthetic appreciation, to make things. This was terribly important for the Victorians, which is why he sort of tried to get rid of this distinction between high and low arts, between art and the crafts. He had no time for that, hence the whole William Morris movement on arts and crafts. So education then, the point of it is to try and cultivate the art of seeing, the ability to observe, to have a cultured mind is exactly that, to be able to see and therefore make judgments and about the world and other people. It wasn't not just preparing people for employment. I don't want to give the sense that it was some sort of just about vocational learning or something. That's not true. But his book, The Elements of Drawing, which became very, very famous, it's mid 19th century. We're talking about some time ago, 170 years ago. That was all about being attentive while you're drawing. And anyone who's had this experience, and I have, I'm sure you have, John, if you first start to learn to draw, the distinction between what you actually put in the paper and what you see, it's such an amazing experience because it diverges so much. And if you learn these skills of acute, very specific observation, proportion, and so on. And it takes a long time. So seeing, in a sense, is not that passive, reception of data through the eyes. Seeing is also an intellectual, active, proactive, and predictive. This is actually confirmed by modern theories of perception as well. In fact, even in this there's a lot of debate in this current AI age from people like Andy Clark and so on, who have written books about the predictive brain. In other words, we're out there actively looking at things. So this whole thing was looking carefully and discriminating and judging. But lastly, is important, one of the bit that's a bit odd, is he had a huge ethical dimension to all this, which is a bit odd because it's hard to see how he did think that an appreciation of beauty, making things, got us away from that notion of the degradation of poor workmanship and poverty and a damaged society. And there's something in that Victorian sensibility, I think. I often walk through, when I'm in my travels through Britain, I often go in the high street. I find them incredibly ugly. There's no care taken over the signage any longer. But if you look at photographs of Victorian Britain, the high streets were aesthetically pleasing, consistent. People made the effort. And I think we've lost some of what Ruskin very cleverly described back then. Did that make sense?
Yeah. You can see that, the idea that art teaches you to look and to see.
Yeah.
That's a pretty transferable skill. I mean, which, in a way, that idea feels like a crowbar that kind of opens art up to a much greater significance. You're not just teaching people to kind of make pots or make paintings. You're teaching them to see and to look in a way which will actually enrich our lives, whatever you're doing. So anyway, let's move on. Next, we have Herbert Reed, 1893 to 1968. Yorkshire-born poet, art critic and philosopher, co-founder of the Institute of Contemporary Arts, the ICA, that very nice building in the Mall, co-editor of the English edition of Jung's collected works, a self-described anarchist who nevertheless, completely at home with that, who nevertheless accepted a knighthood in 1953, sellout, knight, poet, anarchist. Donald, Reed might have betrayed his anarchist roots by accepting a knighthood, but it's interesting that both these figures we've just talked about, socialist and anarchist, come to art from a perhaps rebellious, anti-authority place, but choosing my words carefully here. Is it down to them that the arts has this tinge ever after, or is it that it goes with the territory, that artists have always been rebels and outsiders?
Yeah, well, of course, it depends who you're talking about. There are plenty of
plenty of conservative artists, T.S. Eliot, and
well, exactly. Or there are all sorts of people, in that pantheon as well. But you have a point there. I mean, it's interesting that if you've ever seen a picture of Ruskin, it's that high Victorian, and his prose is really that haughty Gothic, high Gothic Victorian style. There was all of that sort. So it was, and he would. Like John Kerry's book, The Intellectual Masses, so this was all a bit of a bit false. Actually, most people just look down on working class people, full stop, in the arts. There's a very good book on that very topic, in fact. What's interesting about, and Reed was one of those, wore a dicky bow sort of guys. I've met lots of those people, who have a good theoretical view of socialism, but I'm not too sure it was matched by practice. You might go a champagne socialist. So I often take that with a two big, huge pinches of salt, that there's congruence between the two. But this guy was interesting because, Herbert Reed, because he really focused on education throughout. And what do you actually do in schools for real here? If you believe the Ruskin hypothesis that it has a role in intellectual development, which he certainly did, then what do you actually do? And what was interesting about Reed is he grounded it in sort of psychotherapy to a degree, but he had a much broader view of the mind than people who had come before, and certainly Ruskin, because he thought that fundamentally, we cannot see education, and to be honest, that's what we have these days. I often talk about this, and we've talked about it in the podcast. This idea that education should just be about the mind and text and language and logic and abstract reasoning is slightly odd in a way, because most people out there in the real world do not practice that in their everyday life. It's a much more a bit of a mixed bag. So children understand the world through images, movement, dancing, playing the drums as my boy did, rhythm, sensation, all that sort of stuff. So he thought there was a big cognitive root in movement, and we are beings that move through and inside a 3D world, actually doing things as opposed to just sitting and reasoning. And that education, perhaps, even then he saw that it was getting ridiculously imbalanced. You're spending years learning Latin, but you're unable to do anything in the real world. But to be fair, it's very different. I've described a more modern view of cognition there. His was grounded really in psychoanalysis and Gestalt and Jung and so on. So it was very different. Nevertheless, he did think that the whole area of artistic endeavor in schools, drawing, music, drama, and so on, which I firmly believe should be a strong part of any curriculum, were actually cognitive activities. We shouldn't see it as separate from the academic world, but part of it. They're not diversions. They're serious ways of dealing and seeing the world. And so, he thought that we were starting to template kids and force them into this very academic intellectual mold, when and not allowing these differences to emerge. I actually agree with that. So education through art isn't. It's not education in art. Education through art was his big thing. In other words, you use art to experience yourself as a whole person, and not just a narrow, rational, reasoning being. And And he was really dead against this, the culture of over-examining people and just written knowledge being everything. He thought that sort of conformity did real damage to kids. And many, including myself, think that's also that's as true today as it was then. There's a bit of a romantic strain still in his work, a bit of Ruskin-esque stuff, I think, especially when he talks about psychotherapy and so on. I mean, he has one book called Education Through Art, in the 50s, I think that was written, but in the mid-20th century. But it was very influential. You know, that's the thing. You know, we have, especially the sort of child-centered education people, you know, all those the Somervilles and all those sort of people took this very, very seriously. Montessori and that sort of stuff, museum education, all sorts of bits and bobs where Herbert Reed pops up. But I think it was the first awakening into the relationship between cognition or psychology and arts and education.
So next, Elliot Eisner, 1933 to 2014. Fairly recently died. He was a Stanford professor of art and education, Stanford so much to answer for, trained first as a painter, then became one of the most rigorous empirical voices in the field. No romantic, but a lifelong believer that the arts teach forms of thinking nothing else does. Donald Eisner argued that we should judge schools the way a wine connoisseur judges wine, or a critic judges a painting, by educated, articulate perception rather than by test scores alone. Sounds slightly elitist to talk about wine connoisseurs in this kind of context. But does this thinker mark a move away from the previous two? You said you particularly like him. Why?
He takes cognition really seriously and goes back to sort of almost like we're evolved creatures, so we have a sort of biological brain, but of course layered on top of this is a cultural layer, which is definitely true. Yeah. And there's an amount of evolution in the cultural world, you know, since the invention of writing especially, but going back to cave painting and so on, it's clear that the brain also has a cultural level, especially through language, and especially when we start writing and archiving those cultural artifacts, and eventually AI deals with it and delivers something even stranger. But minds are both biological and cultural for him. And that gets interesting because he grounds it in a real view of human nature. He doesn't get all hokey about children being naturally creative and so on. You know, he's really very, almost scientific on this stuff. Very scientific, in fact, I'd say. It's not, you know, it's not based on the creative and aesthetic potential of an individual in any sense. It's just this wider view of cognition that gets away from just the quantification and text-only scientific industrial view, of mechanical view of the brain, towards something much broader. I think that this is where it starts to get very, very interesting, because you can art then becomes a serious sort of intellectual, content-rich activity that matters in terms of those dispositions. So he really, what I like about him is he avoids all those sort of glib assertions about creativity and kids being wonderful and we get stuffing knocked out of them and so on. He didn't see the arts as having a monopoly in creativity, which I like as well, going back to our introduction to this podcast, because the danger is in seeing that it's the domain of this group or my group, but not you. He had a much wider view of the arts, which I think is another strength here. But he was the first to really bring it down in a curriculum issue. You say, well, what we're going to do about this? Because you can have the arts as like one period a week as a bit of a sideline, or you can decide that it's going to be part of the core curriculum, which is what modern people would use. And that actually did happen, to be honest. I think it's in danger of being sidelined again, well, because schooling has become so academic and exam-ridden. And I think there's a huge danger here. So there was a thing he sort of kicked off called the art-based inquiry movement, which was about this, and I was the formal effect. And what he was doing quite cleverly here was ridding the sort of Ruskin romanticism, you know, a correction to romanticism. He thought that the whole discussion around arts, learning and education had been in a cloud of romanticism, which made it a bit vague, whereas it should be based in serious cognitive and curricular discussions. And it really did have an effect. This guy, you know, you really had this sort of STEM to STEAM type move where the A comes into the arts. People put up stout resistance towards just STEM subjects being part of the primary or core curriculum.
Yeah.
So he's looking for deep educational and psychological theory for his ideas. And I think he set a new benchmark for all this now. I think that's the correct way to have approached all this.
So much interesting stuff in that progression. And we can see how art was right from Ruskin onwards, art sort of kind of a public good, as it were. As we move into the sort of post-war welfare state era, there it's kind of part of the development of society. Moving forward to our next theorist, that happens during the triumph of neoliberalism. So, what happens to those ideas then? So, Sir Ken Robinson, 1950 to 2020, Liverpool-born academic and advisor, led the UK government's 1999 Creativity Commission, became via his TED Talk the most watched public voice on education in the world. Donald, I remember watching that famous TED Talk and being very moved by it, especially when he adapts that W.B. Yeats quote at the end. I'm a bit of a sucker for W.B. Yeats, I'm sorry, I must admit. And I recognise that this is hideously sentimental and he was going for the heartstrings. But the quote is, the quote uses at the end, which is kind of paraphrasing Yeats, "Every day, everywhere, our children spread their dreams beneath our feet, and we should tread softly, because we tread upon their dreams. No dry hour in the house." But is there really any substance to his argument, any empirical basis? I'm thinking the answer is no. And do we fetishize creativity in talks like this without really doing anything to create the conditions where it might thrive? And, I suppose I'm going to suggest that it's kind of counterbalance to neoliberalism is that we kind of wrap the thing up in this sort of misty, foggy, hokey kind of emotionality, perhaps. Am I right there?
No, I think that's right. I mean, one of the problems with art and really good narratives, I mean, Robinson's really a child of the internet, and social media, TED Talk, RSA animation and all that stuff. I've given talks a lot, in the same bill as him in BET and some of these big conferences and so on. And I was always astonished because I'm usually quite evidence-based. I give citations on slides and that's like, none of that. It was a complete performance right down to the last breath. He was like a stand-up comic. He had a completely rehearsed view.
It's very funny, actually. Some good jokes.
Oh, yeah, the jokes were incredible. Yeah. But the problem with jokes is they're not true.
I don't know, jokes can't tell the truth.
Well, I often say that when people say, well, shouldn't we make learning fun? I say, well, I've been at the Edinburgh Festival. I love stand-up comedy. I have been at hundreds and hundreds of gigs in stand-up comedy. Can't remember a single joke. Not one. So, and Robbins, I was always astonished, and teachers used to give him standing ovations. I was absolutely I was amazed at this because I'm always looking for the substance. I was going, right, what is this based on? Where's the evidence? None. So the big one, I mean, it's really quite simple, his message, which is what the quote was all about, the Yeats quote, which is kids are creative and school knocks the stuffing out of them. And so, so let's re-inject creativity everywhere back in schools. Now, I think the premise is quite wrong. The premise actually doesn't come from any real learning theory. It comes from Rousseau. So he's a Rousseau guy through and through. This is Emile. This is, something we discussed in a previous podcasting, where the good child, the good human being is corrupted by civilization and schooling. And this is why I was always amazed that teachers would applaud him. The idea that school just corrupts children seemed bizarre to me because I don't think it was true. But he thought that all the ills in education come from this domineering view of society to cripple and atrophy the creative skills of the child, which I don't think is quite true. It's just an unrealistic, over-optimistic, and quite simply wrong view of human nature and development. It's not entirely without truth, but there's no psychological depth to this thing here. So he's really going back to the romanticism of Ruskin a little bit on this stuff. We have a big crisis in society because of the industrialization of society, education being aimed at jobs and so on, and the solution here is to just nurture this spark of creativity. Now, so there are big problems with it. So I used to write a lot about this. It's been a while since I did, but just touching on some of the points here. the word creativity has this big problem, which is it suffers from a problem of definition. So there is a thing called the standard definition of creativity, and what you've got to look for is certain criteria. Try and get a grip or your teeth into this word creativity. So certainly originality, or is it novel? And then not only that, but is it effective or even useful is another useful thing to consider, and other factors like judgments, decision-making come into play. In other words, when you get into like ideation of a new product in a company, it's not the same as Bacon and his painting. It's a very different thing. Is there any common ground between those things? It turns out not much. Now, you used to get these really odd creativity training courses. I remember going to one in the NHS. I talked in the morning. I was bored. My train was later. I went and it was maybe the worst course I've ever attended. And it was the usual thing, how many uses can you find for a brick? Or a paperclip was the other one. This was based on a Guildford alternative uses test, it was called. It goes way back to the 1960s. And it was absolutely hopeless because it confused quantity with quality. Because I knew what the test was going to be, so cheated a bit and had a pre-list. So I think the pass mark for genius and creativity was 15, and I had 25 only because I was cheating the test. And I had things like, killing your wife was one, penis extension. I was not popular with a trainer, put it that way, but we had a laugh. But I was making the point that this is silly. This is not serious, It's a productivity is not enough. And there's a very famous paper on this by, I can't remember his name, Rachel or something. That's the wrong pronunciation, but he sort of squashed this. But still, it didn't matter. Didn't matter that Robinson had no evidence at all for his theory. That he bundled on anyway. And actually, if you look at Robinson's presentation very carefully, it is nothing more than anecdotes. That's really what he relied on. He relied on art to fool you about art theory and give you a wrong view of it, which is quite interesting. And that's the danger. It's a very powerful thing, but it can be used to the wrong ends.
So that's the theory. Let's park that for a bit. Raises many questions, which we may subsequently discuss in other episodes. And move on to chapter 2 of our podcast today, which is applied arts and design. If that's the theory, let's have a look at the practice. In this segment, we're going to cover a whole list of subjects that fall under the heading of applied art and design, including graphic design, product design, fashion, interior design, architecture, illustration, advertising. So, Donald, what do these things have in common in terms of the way they're taught and learned? Because they don't just people don't spring out into the world being able to do this stuff. They need to learn it. How do they learn it, Donald?
Well, I think that's right. And it's often imagined, and the huge debate in arts education, because which Eisner went on and on about, is this notion, and I experienced it myself, being thrown in a room with a bunch of materials and say, make this, do this, as if it was just a free-flowing experience and some creative spark would emerge. And in actual fact, anyone, yourself included, no doubt, John, in music or writing, knows that it's a skill that has to be acquired. Yeah. And sometimes you need to build upon basic skills to get to the next level with more sophisticated skills. So in graphic design and product design, people think it's about getting in a room brainstorming. Not really. You need experienced people who understand the context, understand about materials and product design. In graphic design, it takes years to master the skills of drawing and other media. The basic skills often take many years to master before you become a professional. I think what's interesting, also product design, fashion and all things, is that heart, head and hands, that something that was eliminated from the schooling system was the use of the hands. So we got rid of all the sort of, the rooms I remember, I actually did make things. I did woodwork and made a lamp. I made the thing, I can't remember what you call it now, the knives, forks and spoons going in the kitchen for my mother. We had it for years. I learned woodwork, metalwork. I remember making a copper teaspoon by hammering it out. I loved those subjects, absolutely. Even though I was really quite an academic kid, I really loved those subjects. I did technical drawing even, So, yeah, but we've absolutely got rid of all of that stuff, I think, to the great detriment of the educational system. But I I think what's interesting now, there's something really interesting happening at the moment with all this AI stuff, which is, whether it's graphic design, product design, was it fashion, interior design, all that sort of stuff, I actually think now that a lot of the tools that are becoming available, by and large, graphics people, who doesn't use Adobe Illustrator or whatever, or Autodesk and all that sort of stuff. And even in things like fashion, actually, the CLO's text generator found it's absolutely rife in that field. In other words, people are really using the extension of technology to take some of that grunt work out at the basic level.
Yeah.
I think there's something really interesting happening there, especially in this area of what you might, what we'll call the applied arts and design.
Yeah.
Because the two coincide quite nicely there. Even in interior design, almost everyone now uses a sort of tool of sorts to imagine and show the client what it might actually look like. Certainly in architecture, of course, Autodesk Form and all that sort of stuff. But also in illustration, I think, these... as graphics have moved into vector graphics and they're used in a digital as opposed to a paper way. I remember I was involved in a massive medical project, and it was the head of the NHS, actually, a guy called Alan Langlands ran it. And he was astonished when he came in to run the NHS, in that every medical school and some hospitals even had a medical illustrator. And he was astonished because they were all drawing exactly the same thing. Because the human body is a human body. And, of course, it had just got locked in. Oh, we need an illustrator. It was a job that every teaching hospital had. And, of course, it was absurd, because they were literally drawing the same thing. So that he got rid of that. But that was sort of right in a way. When things become just doing it for the sake of doing, sticking to an old medium for the sake of doing it, then you have to have a little bit of a rethink there. That's not to say illustration is no longer a good thing. Book illustration was interesting, because I remember working with book illustrators. I think a guy we know, Bill, who was an airbrush artist, and I remember working with him on projects when we were both Epic, and they were skilled people, but they all had to, and I remember them fighting the digital thing, but they had to move into it eventually. And now all the books I've published have all got digital covers. There's no...
It's very close to the bone, because my daughter's an illustrator. She does a lot of book illustration.
Yeah, and we still do, yeah. And that's good, because I think
tough.
there's a bit of a backlash against the digital thing as well, where hand-drawn, has become more becomes desirable by contrast.
Yeah. One point I'd like to make about graphic design particularly is I remember my time in an advertising agency. I kind of became a head of marketing, a small part of a very large advertising agency, West End agency, international headquarters in New York and all the rest of it. And it had a design arm, a PR arm, and a direct marketing arm that I was in. And I was tasked to design a brochure. I'd somehow ended up having to design a brochure. Never done any kind of graphics, although I knew a lot of art students. And I was having a go with it, and it was coming out looking a bit manky. My boss said, "Look, go down to the design agency and talk to the head of that, and he'll sort it out for you." So I kind of took my roughs down there, my lecture set, all the rest of it, and I said, "How did I do this?" He kind of scratched his head and took his pencil out and did some sketches. Said, "Well, move that down there, move that down." And, it's the golden section. And I said, "What the fuck is the golden section?" This is something that every art school students will know about. And a lot of people outside that as well. And Fibonacci numbers. My accountant tells me about Fibonacci numbers. It's all to do with numbers and the golden numbers and classical theories of proportion and so on. And he just told me this in about 5 minutes, and the penny dropped. I'm slightly worried now that with AI, and I get AI to whistle up graphics for me all the time, that we will have a generation of people who grow up like me not knowing what the golden section is, or, what the roots of our ideas about proportion and placing and all the rest of it are. But, maybe I'm just being a Luddite there.
Yeah, well, I'm less worried about that, because it is a big issue at the moment. Is it making us dumber? Because I think the very opposite actually happened. So let me start by a similar anecdote. So yesterday I was in a meeting with 4 people and went to design a website for a product called Red Flag. And Callum, my son, he's an AI guy, and we had this massive prompt, and we uploaded all the documents, all the marketing documents, messages, and it produced the website, and it did a brilliant job because it has the golden mean and all that stuff in it, and it was pretty good. But what we could do as a team is concentrate on the creative elements. Is that, is the logo right? Is that color? Because it had a beautiful palette, but we could switch the palette instantaneously. In other words, we didn't actually have to know all the nuts and bolts stuff to come up with a good effect. We could concentrate on what we really needed, which was that, will this appear to somebody when they see it for the first time on that landing page and so on?
Yeah.
And I think that's like a good example is product design, I think, where in the past, you would have to specify the dimensions, the loads of materials, all the manufacturing methods. You have to know all that stuff. Now it knows all that stuff. Why should we? Why should we have to take years to learn stuff that's the invisible stuff when we can focus on the important things, and that's its impact and final look and feel? Now, you may say we won't have judgment to do that, but I think in practice we actually do, because it makes you focus not on just the sort of hookier aspects of does it look good. And God, I spent half my life with graphic artists in education, making things look good but were unintelligible or had spelling errors and all that sort of stuff. It's been in my life for years, as you know, John. But I think, and they were talented people, but they didn't know much about learning, education, keeping it simple, or even spelling. So I think if we can, I think we give those people a greater focus on creativity, literally education. I think this has a huge impact because absolutely, as we speak, coding, for example, is a surprisingly, that's one thing I've done in the past. When you're coding, it's a bit like being God. You type in a few lines, you press a button, and hey presto, it's an amazing thing happens. You go, wow, that's amazing, just from those numbers. But it's a hard-won skill. Now, you can actually describe in text and it will build something. But the aim is to build something. It's not about coding in a way, And I think I don't think this is terribly important. Reducing all those Victorian skills that we had, vast rooms of people doing basic stuff. All these professions matured, and I think became better for it.
It's worth saying that learning this stuff is perhaps not so much with graphic design, which, translates, because it's kind of 2D, largely translates onto using computer screens. But with fashion, you actually have to stitch things. With interior design, you have to walk through buildings and so on. Yeah. Architecture requires people it's a very long training for an architect, and it kind of butts up against fields like geophysics and engineering. I remember in my time in arts PR talking to a guy from Arup who were the structural engineers who actually made the building stand up, and I'm saying architects just draw pictures. We make the buildings stand up. And I thought, well, what are they learning for kind of 7-8 years as architects? But there is a huge amount about kind of materials, the proportions of a person within a room, how a room should be scaled to make it good to live in, heights of ceilings, stuff like that.
No, I wholly agree with that. Yeah. But that's a really good. So let's take two of them. Let's take architecture first, because that's a really interesting one. So that's one I would know. My wife's cousin's husband in architecture, I've talked to him about this, how his tools have changed. So an architect now may in the past have had to know about, let's say a room or a building, had to know about sunlight coming in, where it comes in, daylight, night, wind, noise, carbon, social. There's loads of that background stuff now. Now that's all been automated, and it's better for it because it does it in a more sophisticated way and much, much quicker, leaving the architecture. Funnily enough, architecture has become more of an aesthetic task than a mechanical task in terms of calculating all the forces and so on and so forth.
Which would play to Arup, the guy from Arup's, maintaining that architects just draw pictures.
Well, what they don't, no, they play around with all these things so you can literally have the flow of people through the building, for example, because the architecture used to be a 2D static thing. It's now become the examination of a process. And you then start optimizing those things. And we've all worked in buildings. Where's the toilet? Oh, it's on the third floor type thing, that stuff. But fashion's a really interesting one because it's more of a challenge, isn't it? Because it is literally making, cutting, to the body shape and so on.
Yeah.
There I saw something really interesting. There's this AI texture generator thing. And again, it was a bit like the architecture example we just discussed there, where you can experiment in the digital world with appearance, print, pattern, scale, all that sort of stuff before cutting the fabric. And even the textures, which is quite interesting. Loads of people are using these it sort of gives you alternative textile textures from just by prompting. You say, well, I want it to be more furry or whatever. I don't have the language for it. But I think, once again, it's a good example where the technology is coming in and actually helping people. And they don't necessarily have to cut it in exactly the same way because a machine can cut it. So there's an inevitability about that, I think, right across the board here. Graphic, product design, the interior design, architecture, fashion, and so on. That makes it more interesting for me. You can generate 10 alternatives really quickly, identify the weaknesses and strengths. Oh, that's a trajectory we can go on. You can move through the creative process in an accelerated, much faster fashion.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly helps. And takes a lot of the grunt work out of it. But, if you're in fashion, especially at the high end, you need to touch the stuff. You need to know what the piece of tweed, Harris tweed feels like under your fingers, how it responds to being worked, put into various shapes, what kind of backings you need, blah, blah, blah.
You still have all that. It's absolutely a balance. I would just say that the balance has always changed over time in almost all of those domains, from purely working with materials like paper and pencil towards digital tools, obviously, but now intelligent tools that do some of the more sort of mathematical and difficult stuff, calculable stuff automatically, and leaving you to be, in a sense, to focus on aesthetic, the sort of aesthetic skills you just listed there, John.
Okay, so let's move on to screen and audiovisual arts. So now we come arguably to the most collaborative and industrialized cluster of those things that we're looking today, including in this category film and TV, animation, games, and immersive media, VR, AR, XR, and so on. You can't learn film, for instance, the way that you learn drawing. Actually, film studies now is an A-level subject. It's actually very academic. I learned when my daughter took it. But that won't teach you how to make a film. The unit of work in a film is a crew, so the pedagogy is closer to apprenticeship on production than solo mastery. So learning is role-specific and hierarchical. If you've ever worked on a film set, I've worked on a few TV sets, you will find that the producer's son is a runner. Some kid with a posh accent, privately educated, probably,
exactly what it is.
Who's slumming it as a runner to get into the business. And that might be on to a researcher, to an assistant producer, and to a producer. That you kind of have to go through that process, and it makes it the closest arts analog perhaps to a corporate career ladder. Strangely enough. And also, of course, it's, film and TV, it's big business, big bucks, needs a lot of big funding, huge, great buildings a lot of the time, less and less with green screen and stuff. Donald, the high art, low art thing is quite porous here in terms of films, TV and animation. It's Christopher Nolan producing art cinema. In a way, he is. Games certainly has its advocates on that score, and immersive media is quite common now in art environments. You very often go to an art gallery and there'll be a kind of VR installation as well. You have these, the world of Van Gogh as an immersive experience. Don't touch those things with a barge pole myself. But how do people learn to do this stuff? What's the balance of institutional learning to learning on the job?
This is a more interesting one, because I think there's some things happening here that are quite radical.
Yeah.
So, a good friend of mine, his son, he did a degree at Bournemouth. They've got quite a famous film degree there, and he's now makes films, and so, I followed him. He's a good friend of mine. I followed his progress. We used to get him to do video, and we made a feature. I don't know if you were at Epic. We made a feature film, John.
Oh, The Kiloton.
The Killer Tongue, yeah. I lost
we
so
covered
much money on
earlier
that.
in
It's
the series,
unbelievable. So I've
well, you can lose your shirt in film production, of course.
Oh, yeah. I lost my shirt, my underpants, and my socks. Anyway, I think this is interesting because something quite radical is happening here. Now, the Nolan thing is interesting because that's a bit like this, let's deliberately not use any digital stuff for the sake of it. I actually think the film suffers from this. But come back to the main thesis here, I think. We are in an age now where you can use text to prompt video and film, and people are. And of course, Hollywood went on strike because of this, because they feel that the imposition of AI will actually lead to job losses, which hasn't happened. In actual fact, there's been this huge expansion. We have a renaissance of TV and film because of streaming. Curiously, because of AI, because that's all the menus you see on screen are all mediated by it. And of course, every movie you see, you don't know what's real and not because CGI is so omnipresent. So you've got this sort of complete enveloping of the industry by AI, but they don't want it, except when they need it. But something more serious is happening now. So Martin Scorsese is suddenly doing all his pre-production using AI. So all the storyboarding is done in AI using a German company. You've got actually films like the Eternauts, which actually have AI-generated sequences in them. This is increasingly happening. They sort of like to keep it hidden because there's a sort of, there's union issues and all sorts of things. But it's certainly the case that we are now in the age where fully fledged things can be spun up super quick. Now, I think it's the same argument. I think we've yet to see. I don't see why that would necessarily, the fact that you have to spend several months in odd locations before you ever get any sense of what this film's going to look like, other than the storyboard. I think the jury's out. Will this lead to more conformity, more templatey stuff, or will it lead to a renaissance of creativity? You already see amazingly creative stuff happening in that space, almost different genres of film coming out, because it's been deeply affected by the Reels phenomenon, and TikTok and so on. So we see different genres emerge, but that doesn't mean to say people aren't going and watching The Odyssey and sitting in a cinema for nearly 3 hours. So I think we're expanding the range of genres. We're speeding up the process of production, making it cheaper. Making things cheaper and easier allows a wider range of creative people to participate. You just cannot rock up and make a feature film without a big 6-figure sum. Full stop. Now, you sort of can. Isn't that a good thing? Isn't that what punk was about? Isn't it what we've seen in all sorts of areas of art?
It's always happened. There's always been kind of, low-budget indie stuff where people beg, borrow, and steal and do favors, and I've been involved in kind of shooting stuff like that as well. I think there is a point here, though, that it's about kind of access to the profession, which is to do with how you use it. And that thing about the runners being the producer's son. There is a lot of talk nowadays about actors all being Nepo babies. It's harder to get into the acting profession if you're not from a bougie kind of background. Similarly with getting into art. My memory of being on film sets is that there is this whole kind of area of artisanal. Difficult to use in this context. People get very upset about it, but kind of artisan. Trades like being a lighting man, being the perhaps cameraman to a less extent, but a lot of the things like kind of set designers, people who paint sets or set dressers, people who scout locations and so on. There's an aspect of that which is, are we talking about kind of vocational education, colleges? Is there anything that government can do to help people with access into that industry?
Well, we have, of course, film degrees and so on, but the problem is that the data suggests that most people who do those don't actually end up working in those fields. That's partly because the nepotistic
they become critics. I mean, it's similar with kind of English literature and creative writing. People who study English literature tend to become critics because that's what they teach you to do at university.
Yeah, that's certainly not what the Bournemouth course, the film production courses. There's a differentiation between them, but they certainly become very knowledgeable in film. They're passionate about it. Normally, you're absolutely right there, John. But I think I think the big issue here is that world is changing, and that there are people with really big skills, like a graphic artist used to work for me. Now, then went on to do the CGI work in films like Gladiator and so on. So there was that route from traditional graphics into that higher end work. In fact, he still goes away for months and then doing that graphics work. So, but I still come back to it's not so much, I mean, there is an interesting issue we might touch upon it, because I was in the arts for 10 years, solidly, and I've become quite depressed about the state of the arts currently because of this. I mean, it proclaims diversity, but it's the very opposite. I saw the programmers and so on, even the work that's commissioned is by a tiny select group who have a very specific moral and political agenda, and then you get the same old regurgitated plays time and time again. Political theatre is dead. There's no way you can come out of the liberal orthodoxy on stage these days without being ripped. So I think there's a narrowing, funnily enough, because of the educational system, because it is what it is. It produces a certain perspective on life, which is reflected in the output. This is why I'm all in favor of technology ripping the hell out of this stuff, because I think as soon as we start to democratize it and get into the hands of other people, good things happen. But I take punk almost as my, my lighthouse here, because that actually happened. Anybody could do it, and look what happened. It was fantastic. But actually, the very opposite has happened in the arts recently, I think. There's been a narrowing down. Oh, you need a degree? Are you kidding me? Wait, there is no Sex Pistols then. There is no Clash. There's nothing. There might be Spandau Ballet or something, but that's it. The Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Beatles are not product of the educational system.
So our next creative cluster is visual arts, and this includes painting, drawing, printmaking, sculpture, photography, digital and video art, crafts, ceramics, textiles, and jewellery. And this is perhaps the oldest pedagogy that we're going to cover here, especially with art. It's the historic model of the atelier, a master's studio where students progress from cast drawing to life drawing to composition, learning by imitation, repetition, and close individual critique. The critique's a very important part of art education. Advanced students eventually work on the master's own commissions, and there's you very often hear of this. A painting that was thought to be Raphael actually turns out to have been mostly painted by one of his advanced students. Modern art schools have moved to a more conceptual and self-directed work, with peer criticism an important part of the process. And we can talk about that change. And then there's the whole craft area, lower status, often gendered, often taught vocationally. And there's any craft area you might mention, there seems to be a television reality show about it now. They've got one for people sewing stuff. They've got one for potters. And they're all very entertaining, I think. Donald, surely this is where we see the high culture, low culture divide at its starkest, and also the cluster that Anglophone listeners will think of most readily when you talk about art with a capital A, not with potting, but with art. But what is there in the way that these things are taught in the UK particularly that accounts for the extraordinary dynamism of this sector? I mean, it has been, in the second half of the 20th century and forward, an extraordinarily dynamic sector. You don't only get great painters and sculptors out of the British art school tradition, Hockney, Freud, Hirst, etc. You also get great rock bands, Beatles, the Stones. Eric Clapton, I think, studied stained art designing at an art college. Of course, David Bowie, he was had art college roots. He's Peter Frampton, the guitarist. His father was an art school teacher, and he taught David Bowie. What is all that about? What was the secret sauce there, if you like?
Well, I think this is the most interesting of the categories, John, for the following reason: it has the deepest cultural roots. So if you take painting, drawing, for example, then I was last year in Lascaux, where it's 40,000-year-old amazingly skilled and beautiful, aesthetically beautiful pictures of animals in caves. I've been in ones in northern Spain. It's a real sort of interest of mine. So this has cognitive roots, cultural roots going back tens of thousands of years, the
Yeah.
visual arts, painting, and also sculpture, because you can also at the same time in those caves see 3D sculptures of bison and 3D things that have been created from clay normally, of course. And then, of course, you've got the craft and some ceramics thing. Pots were perhaps the very first things we made, which interestingly in culture have utility, but often if you look at a beautiful, I was looking at some stuff yesterday, it was actually doing the Odyssey thing. If you look at Mycenaean pottery with these beautiful octopuses and double spirals, so this is at the same time as the Odyssey, effectively, about 1300 BC. It is this combination of art and utility, which is quite interesting. Now, jump to the modern day. I think we had a very good system for encouraging that art and utility to produce wonderful things, whether it be paintings, drawings, print, sculpture, whatever, which we completely knocked on the head in 1993 when we turned all our art schools basically into departments and universities. I think it has crippled the whole movement, over-academicized the thing, so that you didn't have those, those sort of weird routes from studying stained art to becoming one of the best guitarists in the world. That no longer happens. You're in this almost curricular route, and there you shall stay, and actually not very often get a job in what you've studied. But because we lost that freedom of expression and movement that the art college system did. So we literally doubled the number of universities, 1992, 93, and boy, have we suffered from that since, not only in the creative realm, but in other realms as well, because everything became more what Eisner fought against, and Ruskin, and Reed. This notion that everything should be based on theory and text and critiquing text and writing essays. We've gone back to that. And this is exactly what they warned us against in the 19th century and throughout the 20th century. Don't atrophy the mind in this way. But it's what we did. And what do we have? We have economic stagnation. I would say in the arts, we have a narrowing of output. I don't see evidence that it's flourishing myself. That's a personal view. I think it's got a very narrow cast. I think we're suffering badly for it. So I wholly agree. I don't know if you do agree with me on that one, John, but the art school system gave the right pedagogic freedom, this combination of aesthetics and art and utility, which mattered a lot. Photography is a really interesting one in this because all of these things have been subject again to this massive influence of technology. So we all have an amazing camera in our pockets. I no longer use photography as a hobby of mine. I no longer use my SLR, it's gathering dust, because my iPhone is absolutely superb. I can even do my post-production on my iPhone. And of course, you've got the distribution and publishing media for photography that has exploded online because every 15-year-old is effectively a publisher. And so I think you've had an amazing renaissance and explosion of creativity in that area, which older people would disagree with, but I think it's definitely true. I think it's also true to a degree of writing, to be honest. I think people miss this. Young people are incredibly good at being very concise with language because of that. But we'll come at that perhaps on another day. But, photography, painting is an interesting one because it's dying a death a little bit, I feel. It's become very esoteric for many people. The exhibitions we go to see in London tend to be Zubaren, which is currently on at the Royal Academy or whatever. You're going back centuries. That's what the focus is on, rather than, look at this fresh young painter. Do we have any big blockbuster actual people who paint for a living at the moment? Not too sure.
Yeah, not so much. As regards the art school tradition, what's happened to them, I agree with you in one way and not in another. One way in which I agree is that I think it's really tedious that you go to an exhibition now, the captions are just huge. You get these huge essays and manifestos you have to read full of words like liminal.
Yes.
This artist in a liminal space, which for me is a red flag. Whenever I see that, I think, what does that mean? They they live in a seaside town. I don't know. I don't understand it. And it's got very kind of wordy and conceptual.
Very true.
On the other hand, my kind of experience of, the punk explosion, which was art schools played a big role in that, much bigger than is very often acknowledged. And also what came after it in the 80s with kind of, the New Romantics and that kind of explosion after an explosion. I mean, ska boom, Jerry Dammer's art school man to his roots, who invented the two-tone graphic style, which my saxophone player tells me was stolen from him. But there you go. And it was improvisational. It was kind of, it seized the means of production because people realized they could start their own record label. I remember going to pressing plants and so on with the indie label, that screen printing our own album covers, that kind of stuff. It was making everything down to taking out the gatekeepers. In a way, it was kind of a pre-echo of what would happen with the internet, that kind of democratized things. And people were improvisational, and they did the stuff. We all had no money. We was all one. Blah 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 blah. I've got a lot of faith in creative people to operate in the cracks and to create things. To make a heaven in hell's despite, to quote Blake, it's what people do. They take over warehouses, and you get this kind of thing in the cities where artists will move into the cheap places and to the housing stock nobody wants that are cheap, and then they will create them into very desirable neighborhoods that the gentry want to then move into, and the house prices go up, so and so on. So the danger is that process comes to an end, that there is no cheap place to live in London anymore. And you certainly see with this with the kids. But I think the more that the world tries to shut down to fill in all the cracks, to make it impossible not to have to kind of put everything on paper, I think creative people will find ways around that.
Well, I think the space where people can just experiment and do things is interesting. I'm not that bothered about people in London because I would say that, in music, as many good, if not more, good bands have come from Liverpool, Manchester. And these kids did have the freedom to do that because they weren't
Let's not start talking about Manchester.
Yeah, but the interesting thing is in space, there is also the sort of digital space and tools, because anybody can be an artist. And I think that's right. It's true. That in the theory of aesthetics, you have this very interesting moment with Andy Warhol, which completely says, actually, art is anything you want it to be. And then it becomes warped into the institutional theory of art, which I completely disagree with. But actually, if we hold on to that Warhol idea, where suddenly the Brillo pad is an art, though we never saw it as art because it was a brand, we suddenly have this explosion of opportunities. That is exactly what the internet gave us, and I think AI will give it as well, because you can take the sort of weirdly mechanical stuff out to focus on being whatever that creative thing is. And I think we see that already. I think you see, bands now can shoot their own videos on their mobile phones, and they do. They can make their music in their bedrooms, which they do. So I think that was never possible before, but that damn well is now.
Yeah.
And I think that's led to, funnily enough, an explosion, but then it also comes down to control of the means of distribution, because you still have the giant record label, you still have radio, you still have can we get on the BBC?
Yeah.
Because during punk, most people couldn't.
gatekeepers.
People forget the censorious nature of the institutions holds things back at the top, as well as the feeds in education. But on education, I think I really do believe in this notion of rebalancing. I would literally merge dozens of universities and reinstate a sort of polytechnic art school system again. It wouldn't be that difficult. And that don't do research, that concentrate on the creative work itself, the craft, the art.
Which is where it used to be, in fact, didn't it? I mean,
yes, absolutely.
Art schools
Still
were
is in some
part of the
countries.
kind of vocational end of things,
Sure.
the tech schools and so on.
Still true in the Netherlands.
Educational rejects who hadn't kind of got their exams at school would be chucked out to the art schools, and that's where you got people like kind of Ron Wood and Keith Richard from.
So I think we should look forward, I think, to a flourishing of genres, a flourishing of activity, because everything's easier, cheaper, and also more accessible. You can publish directly to people. You can put something up and get 1 million likes.
We've sort of slopped over from one category to another because
we're
now talking about performing arts. Yes. Obviously, the cluster close to my heart, and perhaps I've already banged on about it enough as a one-time gigging musician. In this category, it becomes music, theatre, dance, opera, and performance art. Performance art is extraordinarily kind of vibrant at the moment. I've just been reading in the New Yorker about stuff at the Venice Biennale. There's some very disparate elements to this. Donald, how do we talk about this in terms of education? I mean, my experience was that, like every other 1960s budding musician, I learned 3 chords from Burt Whedon's Playing a Day. And I think even kind of great guitarists like Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck and so on learned from the same book, but they did a bit more with it. And I was completely self-taught as a musician, more or less. My daughter has just finished at Trinity College of Music Conservatoire in London, studying jazz flute for 4 years. A very different experience, but hanging around with her and her musician friends, there's a lot of commonality in that. How do we talk about education within this category, performing arts?
Well, just empirically, you've seen this recent explosion. People are going on these massive world tours, and tens of thousands of people are turning up. In this, last Sunday I went to see Fatboy Slim, and it was 20 years ago when 250,000 people turned up on Brighton Beach. I was there with my kids when they were 10. We went back last Sunday. Fantastic. But these are not, Fatboy Slim is not a product of the educational system in classical music.
It's a product of the House Martins. I knew him when he was the bass player in House Martin. Yeah.
And then tomorrow I'm going to see Nick Cave. And, but you look at the whole Taylor Swift, Rolling Stones will still go on tour, in their 80s. Yeah. There is this thirst for live experiences, high volume dance, being with other people thing, which is undoubtedly true. Now, we have to be careful here because that's actually not true in theatre dance and theatre dance, opera, and performance art, because they are actually very tiny numbers of people compared to this. I mean, minuscule, and actually massively, massively subsidised. I mean, it is sort of almost obscene the amount of money opera gets subsidised by in capital cities in Europe especially. And the same is true of theatre. Theatre just doesn't work, really. Musical theatre does. Musical theatre doesn't work without funding. I found that, I was the sort of business guy on an arts board, and believe me, it was hard work because almost all the money, apart from what you take in the door in the bar, comes from the Art Council or a grant of one form or another, which is the tax base. So I think this is a really interesting area, but I go back to my theory before, which is it's actually been made easier, funnily enough, to put on these giant gigs using technology. If you see people in the Sphere in Las Vegas, so I have a friend who manages an artist who just did that recently. This huge robot in the Sphere. There are things happening in that area that are being affected by technology that make it easier at the root end, but also more spectacular at the effects end for audiences.
Donald, talk about education. Do you think it's a good thing nowadays that there's been a move to give people at art schools kind of lessons in how to market themselves, how to negotiate the commercial side of being an artist and a performer?
You have the growth of the BIM and FAME schools, that's produced artists, but is it such a bad thing that Adele comes out of that? And I'm not too sure that it is necessarily. I think actually a better focus, a more interesting area to discuss there is schools. So in schools, we've had. This is absolutely true, and I'm not exaggerating this. In my secondary school, I never got offered an instrument, never picked up an instrument. Our music lessons were sitting in a room while somebody plonked out hymns and green sleeves and Scottish songs on a piano, and we sang along. That was it. This idea that education has played a big role in all this, actually all it did was prevent me from having any access to an instrument because, we wouldn't have afforded it. Well, it could have, but it wasn't in the culture. But I think now, look, start different. So my son reads music, plays the drums. He's not a musician, didn't go on to be a professional musician, but he played the drums for years and years and years. And loves loads of genres, from old time jazz right through to modern jazz and so on. But that had nothing to do with the school. Nothing to do with the school. And I think the danger is in embedding too much of this in the schools because I don't think they deliver well in this. I think that's where subsidies come in well. Now, Brighton does this quite well. We have a whole sort of music division in the local authorities that pays music teachers to teach kids. That's how it happened for my son. We had an old school drummer.
My daughter's one of them. She's on the music service in Brighton.
Yeah, the music service.
We should also mention the fantastic amount of grassroots organisations. I mean, Brighton has a number of these. Of course, Tomorrow's Warriors that my daughter was part of, that's how she started jazz performing first, is a marvellous institution that has kind of promoted this incredible growth of jazz in the UK in the last few years and so on. The grassroots is really important, the stuff that happens in the gaps.
So if we're looking for a solution to the learning and educational problem, I think that's a really interesting sort of vein to mine there. In the Dome, we had a 1 week rock school thing by a very famous musician, bass player, but then, of course, for 1 week, kids went in at the beginning, they had to perform in the Dome at the end of the week. It was astonishing. My son did that, and the kids, it was an astonishing, they would write songs, compose the music, rehearse, and perform. And boy, was it amazing, the final show. Now, that sort of stuff is short and sharp. This is what I really believe in. Forget about the long degree courses. Look for the short, sharp courses and things to get people moving and let them find their way forward here. I think that's true in vocational stuff in general, because it's a long apprenticeship performing, as you know, John, and also acquiring skills in the musical instrument.
Well, when you say short and sharp, I mean, a lot of those organisations, you can have contact with one of those kind of rock school things for quite a while, and they'll see you through coming in, being a complete amateur, and then through to early performances, and then performances at festivals, perhaps, where they have they'll have a special stage. They have a special stage at Love Supreme Festival for Next Generation Jazzers, and that is kind of through a grassroots organisation called New Generation Jazz and so on. That kind of stuff, you see real learning because it's really hands-on. It's about performance. It's about getting people together in groups and so on.
And festivals have been a good conduit for this. Again, it's that example of learning in the real world as opposed to in a formal educational institution. And I think that's an important thing for me in this realm because being stuck in the course and in the classroom will give you the basic skills of learning an instrument or whatever, but only for certain art forms, really. And that's where maybe drama school, for example. But at the end of the day, the real skills are honed in the real world. And so the subsidies should go towards that. I think the ecosystem is important. And has changed for the better. But technology allows you to do that as well, because the real ecosystem, which we haven't really discussed much, isn't really that live stuff at all. It is online.
Okay.
It absolutely is. So, most of the people who are performing and doing stuff are actually there online compared to the quite paltry number of live events still.
And you can make a top 10 single in your bedroom.
One thing we didn't discuss as well in terms of the learning, one thing that I think has sort of revolutionized the world of all of these things really, but especially music, of course, but is the ability to learn to do those things online. So I don't have numbers in this, but my guess is that rather than learning from those old books you used to get from music shops and guitar, that most kids are learning from chord shapes and various bits of tech and so on.
Oh yeah, if you want to learn to play something as a guitarist now, you just kind of Google up the chord, gives you the chords, piano chords.
That's right.
Just to sum up, I've got 2 questions for you.
Okay.
Number one, if we spool forwards 5 years into the future, how much of the creative work we've discussed will still be done humans? Number two, given that LLMs have crawled my novel, my song lyrics, and every single blog post or white paper I've ever written, including the scripts and transcripts of all my podcast episodes, all the TV things I appeared in and wrote, when am I going to get my universal basic income?
Well, I'll answer the last one first then. I mean, I was looking at some of the latest models, well, in fact, 2 models ago, the data set was so big that it would take one human being 700,000 years to read it, reading 7 days a week at 8 hours a day.
Ow.
So when people say, well, I need to be paid for mine, it's actually such an infinitesimal fraction. Even if you got paid, it would be a fraction of a pence or something.
I'm not talking about royalties. I'm talking about UBI.
Oh, UBI, that's a political issue. And I'm
need to
with you on
eat
that
to
one.
do this.
I'm with you on that one. If some of the tech bros claim that this world of AI produces superabundance, and then from that, and then huge productivity and therefore huge wealth, then we should all get our share. There is a problem here. If nobody's working, where does the tax come from? So actually you need a different economic model and a different structure to extract the tax from these large companies. Where are the large companies? They're in America and Ireland. So, and Ireland have been scraping that money away from us for years because they offered a lower rate of tax, and all our sales tax on music and everything gets creamed off for the Irish economy. So I think we have to take some big political steps there. So that's a serious issue. The first one, going back, I go 5 years into the future. Now, so I've been writing a lot about this and in these books on AI and so on. In terms of creative work, what you'll see, I think there are 2 things. One, the fuel mixture changes dramatically. We saw this in film, where you can literally create from a prompt, a scene, a really sophisticated script and prompt, an entire story. That is happening as we're speaking. So I think you'll see the fuel mixture, the ability to create things, will be much faster, much cheaper, and more democratic. You're disintermediating lots of mechanical steps as well as institutions and organizations that are going to rip you off. So I think that's a very positive thing. The fuel mixture, the means of production changes. It's in the hands of the creator, not the distributor so much. But then, what effect will that have on output is an interesting one. There's one school says they'll just dumb everything down, that it's a bit like having 50, forms of mustard in the supermarket. We spoiled by so much weird choice, nothing matters any longer. I completely disagree with that because people have a keen eye for something that's novel, interesting, and really moves them. And that's what matters. It's all about feeling. It's not about text and reading and critiquing and critics. So I think we will see many more genres emerge because of this technology, especially AI, much more activity, and in every area of artistic endeavor we've discussed today. And, I see mostly positives. The negative would be if AI economically, which goes back to the other question, actually scrapes off all the cash and leaves us like an impoverished underclass, where the rich are plundering the poor. To be honest, that's been happening for a long time before AI. I think you can't pin it on AI, but I would hope that AI offers the opportunity to free us from that paradigm.
The trick is getting paid for it.
That's exactly it.
Thank you very much for that. I enjoyed it, perhaps a bit too much. And we'll be back again in your feed very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, what's the point if it's not fun?
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. We'd also like to extend a heartfelt thanks to our sponsors for this season.